Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant. Preface. Ancient Greek philosophy was divided into three sciences: physics, ethics, and logic. This division is perfectly suitable to the nature of the subject, and there is no need to improve upon it, except, perhaps, to add its principle, partly so as to ensure its completeness and partly so as to be able to determine correctly the necessary subdivisions. All rational cognition is either material and concerned with some object, or formal and occupied only with the form of the understanding and of reason itself, and with the universal rules of thinking in general, without distinction of objects. Formal philosophy is called logic, whereas material philosophy, which has to do with determinate objects and the laws to which they are subject, is in turn divided into two. For these laws are either laws of nature or laws of freedom. The science of the first is called physics, and that of the other is ethics. The former is also called the doctrine of nature, the latter the doctrine of morals. Logic can have no empirical part, that is, no part in which the universal and necessary laws of thinking would rest on grounds taken from experience. For in that case, it would not be logic, that is, a canon for the understanding or for reason, which holds for all thinking and which must be demonstrated. On the other hand, natural as well as moral philosophy can each have its empirical part, since the former must determine laws of nature as an object of experience, the latter, the laws of human beings' will insofar as it is affected by nature, the first as laws in accordance with which everything happens, the second as laws in accordance with which everything ought to happen, while still taking into account the conditions under which it very often does not happen. All philosophy, insofar as it is based on grounds of experience, can be called empirical. But insofar as it sets forth its teachings simply from a priori principles, it can be called pure philosophy. When the latter is merely formal, it is called logic, but if it is limited to determinate objects of the understanding, it is called metaphysics. In this way, there arises the idea of twofold metaphysics: a metaphysics of nature and a metaphysics of morals. Physics will therefore have its empirical part, but it will also have a rational part. So too will ethics, though here the empirical part might be given the special name practical anthropology, while the rational part might properly be called morals. All trades, crafts, and arts have gained by the division of labor, namely, when one person does not do everything, but each limits himself to a certain task that differs markedly from others in the way it is to be handled, so as to be able to perform it most perfectly and with greater facility. Where work is not so differentiated and divided, where everyone is a jack of all trades, their trades remain in the greatest barbarism. Whether pure philosophy in all its parts does not require its own special man might in itself be a subject not unworthy of consideration, and it might be worth asking whether the whole of this learned trade would not be better off if a warning were given to those who, in keeping with the taste of the public, are in the habit of vending the empirical mixed with the rational in all sorts of proportions unknown to themselves, who call themselves independent thinkers, and others who prepare the rational part only, hair splitters. The warning not to carry on at the same time two jobs which are very distinct in the way they are to be handled, for each of which a special talent is perhaps required, and the combination of which, in one person, produces only bunglers. Here, however, I ask only whether the nature of science does not require that the empirical part always be carefully separated from the rational part, and that a metaphysics of nature be put before physics proper, empirical physics, and a metaphysics of morals before practical anthropology, with metaphysics carefully cleansed of everything empirical, so that we may know how much pure reason can accomplish in both cases, and from what sources it draws this a priori teaching of its own. Whether the latter job be carried on by all teachers of morals, whose name is legion, or only by some who feel a calling to it. Since my aim here is directed properly to moral philosophy, I limit the question proposed only to this. Is it not thought to be of the utmost necessity to work out for once a pure moral philosophy, completely cleansed of everything that may be only empirical and that belongs to the anthropology? For that there must be such a philosophy is clear of itself from the common idea of duty and of moral laws. Everyone must grant that a law, if it is to hold morally, that is, as a ground of obligation, must carry with it absolute necessity. That, for example, the command, "Thou shalt not lie," does not hold only for human beings, as if other rational beings did not have to heed it, and so with all other moral laws, properly so called. That, therefore, the ground of obligation here must not be sought in the nature of the human being, or in the circumstances of the world in which he is placed, but a priori simply in concepts of pure reason, and that any other precept, which is based on principles of mere experience, even if it is universal in a certain respect, insofar as it rests in the least part on empirical grounds, perhaps only in terms of a motive, can indeed be called a practical rule, but never a moral law. Thus, among cognitions, not only do moral laws, along with their principles, differ essentially from all the rest, in which there is something empirical, but all moral philosophy is based entirely on its pure part, and when it is applied to the human being, it does not borrow the least thing from acquaintance with him, from anthropology, but gives to him, as a rational being, laws a priori, which no doubt still require a judgment sharpened by experience, partly to distinguish in what cases they are applicable, and partly to provide them with access to the will of the human being and efficacy for his fulfillment of them. For the human being is affected by so many inclinations that, though capable of the idea of a practical pure reason, he is not so easily able to make it effective in concreto in the conduct of his life. The metaphysics of morals is therefore indispensably necessary, not merely because of a motive to speculation for investigating the source of the practical basic principles that lie a priori in our reason, but also because morals themselves remain subject to all sorts of corruption as long as we are without that clue and supreme norm by which to appraise them correctly. For in the case of what is to be a morally good, is it not enough that it conform with the moral law, but it must also be done for the sake of the law? Without this, that conformity is only very contingent and precarious, since a ground that is not moral will indeed now and then produce actions in conformity with the law, but it will also often produce actions contrary to the law. Now, the moral law, in its purity and genuineness, and in the practical, that is what matters most, it is to be sought nowhere else than in a pure philosophy. Hence, this metaphysics, which must come first, and without it there can be no moral philosophy at all. That which mixes these pure principles with empirical ones does not even deserve the name of philosophy, for that distinguishes philosophy from common rational cognition, is just that it sets forth in separate sciences what the latter comprehends only mixed together. Much less does it deserve the name of moral philosophy, since by this very mixture it even infringes upon the purity of morals themselves, and proceeds contrary to its own end. Let it not be thought, however, that what is here called for already exists in the celebrated Wolff's propedeutic in his moral philosophy, namely in what he called universal practical philosophy, and that we do not therefore have to break into an entirely new field. Just because it was to be a universal practical philosophy, it took into consideration not a will of any special kind, such as one that would be completely determined from a priori principles without any empirical motives, and that could be called a pure will, but rather volition generally, with all the actions and conditions that belong to it in this general sense. And by this it differs from a metaphysics of morals in the same way that general logic, which sets forth the action and rules of thinking in general, differs from transcendental philosophy, which sets forth the special actions and rules of pure thinking, that is, of thinking by which objects are cognized completely a priori. For the metaphysics of morals has to examine the idea and the principles of a possible pure will and not the actions and conditions of human volition generally, which for the most part are drawn from psychology. That this universal practical philosophy also discusses, though without any warrant, moral laws and duties is no objection to my assertion, for the authors of that science remain true to their idea of it in this too. They do not distinguish motives that, as such, are represented completely a priori by reason alone, and are properly moral from empirical motives, which the understanding raises to universal concepts merely by comparing experiences. Instead, they consider motives only in terms of the greater or smaller amount of them, without paying attention to the difference of their sources, since all of them are regarded as of the same kind. And this is how they form their concept of obligation, which is anything but moral, although the way it is constituted is all that can be desired in a philosophy that does not judge at all about the origin of all practical concepts, whether they occur in posteriori or a priori as well. Intending to publish someday a metaphysics of morals, I issue this groundwork in advance. Indeed, there is really no other foundation for a metaphysics of morals than a critique of pure practical reason, just as that of metaphysics is the critique of pure speculative reason, already published. But, in the first place, the former is not of such utmost necessity as the latter, because in moral matters human reason can easily be brought to a high degree of correctness and accomplishment, even in the most common understanding, whereas in its theoretical but pure use it is wholly dialectical. And in the second place, I require that the critique of a pure practical reason, if it is to be carried through completely, be able at the same time to present the unity of practical with speculative reason in a common principle, since there can, in the end, be only one and the same reason, which must be distinguished merely in its application. But I could not yet bring it to such completeness here without bringing into it considerations of wholly different kind, and confusing the reader. Because of this, I have made use of the title Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals instead of Critique of Pure Practical Reason. But in the third place, since a metaphysics of morals, despite its intimidating title, is yet capable of a degree of popularity and suitability for the common understanding, I find it useful to separate from it this preliminary work of laying its foundation, so that in the future I need not add subtleties, which are unavoidable in it, to teachings more easily grasped. The present groundwork is, however, nothing more than a search for and establishment of the supreme principle of morality, which constitutes by itself a business that in its purpose is complete and to be kept apart from every other moral investigation. No doubt my assertions on this important and central question, discussion of which has till now been far from satisfactory, would receive a great deal of light from the application of the same principle to the whole system, and of confirmation through the adequacy that it would everywhere show. But I had to forego this advantage, which would be, after all, more gratifying to me than commonly useful, since the facility with which a principle can be used and its apparent adequacy furnish no quite certain proof of its correctness, but instead awaken a certain bias against rigorously investigating and weighing it in itself, and without any regard for what follows from it. I have adopted in this work the method that is, I believe, most suitable if one wants to proceed analytically from common cognition to the determination of its supreme principle, and in turn synthetically from the examination of this principle and its source back to the common cognition in which we find it used. Accordingly, the division turns out as follows. First section, transition from common rational to philosophic moral cognition. Second section, transition from popular moral philosophy to metaphysics of morals. And third section, final step from metaphysics of morals to the critique of pure practical reason.